In this lecture, we'll discuss beneficial AI and machine ethics. So the premise is that in contrast to previous lectures where we spoke about making AI systems more reliable and organizations more reliable, this lecture is about how do we make the AI systems beneficial. So if we fix all those reliability challenges, is it still difficult to have good outcomes? So this is focusing on making sure that AI systems can have good outcomes. And so machine ethics is the study of how to ensure that AIs behave ethically toward others. It's not about how to make them more reliable, but just how to make them more beneficial. So we'll discuss various approaches to embedding ethics into AIs and the challenges of each of those approaches. There's a lot of different concepts that we'll cover in this lecture. We'll talk about the law. We'll talk about what happens if the only demand we made of AIs was that they would follow the law. Would this be sufficient for broadly beneficial behavior? Then we'll examine another concept of making AIs more fair and what that means when one talks about fairness more specifically. The economic engine section will be about how we expect to be influenced by the economy and whether that results in good or bad outcomes. Next, we'll discuss well-being. We'll show that the economic engine produces a lot of value, but it isn't identical to it increasing human well-being. And so we'll try and break down what well-being means, and we'll emphasize two concepts in well-being, that of preferences and that of happiness. In the interest of time, we'll skip our discussion of social welfare functions in this lecture and leave that to the text. And then at the end, we'll take stock of the various things we've discussed and note that we're kind of uncertain as to which value systems will be best and what goals should be put in these AI systems, what their commands should be. And moral uncertainty helps us handle and think about what we should do, given that we're uncertain about what theory or value system is correct or best. So first, we'll speak about law and then fairness. One question somebody could ask is, why do we need to worry about machine ethics? Can't we just have AIs follow the law? Won't that be sufficient for good outcomes? And the law has a lot going for it. If AIs just follow the law, we can expect this to take care of a lot of ways in which AIs could be very harmful. We'll speak about some of the properties of law, such as the fact that it is legitimate. So keyword is legitimate. It is a legitimate representation of many moral values. The law is time-tested and it is comprehensive. We'll look into what laws are made up of briefly and that they use rules and standard. And we'll argue that the law is relatively specific and it is quite adaptable. So the law aggregates various values, which makes it legitimate. In a democracy, the populace influences the law. They do so by electing judges. There's voting on new laws. There's a lot of protesting and advocating. Representatives will come with legislation, which will affect the law. And so the law is legitimate. Citizens have substantial input into its design. This is unlike the AIs designed by big tech companies. People are not electing who is in charge of the responsible AI team at Google DeepMind, for instance. It is not a legitimate institution. Meanwhile, the law is legitimate. So the law is much less arbitrary than the value systems that others put into AIs. And it is also much clearer. It can be more publicly analyzed. And there is a lot less of a chance of a person randomly embedding their own value system into these AIs. Some other desirable features of law is that it is time-tested and comprehensive. It is a much iterated approximation of our values. There's been generations of successfully creating, altering, enforcing, and interpreting these laws. There's been a record of what has worked. And the law, looking under the hood, one thing that the law is made up of, what keeps getting adjusted in this evolution of the law, is its text, which are made up of a variety of things. Two things to point out would be that there are rules and standards in the law. So rules are rigid instructions which reduce interpretation problems. And there are standards, which are flexible statements which allow for proportional responses and reduce the problems of over or under inclusivity. For example, a rule would be do not drive faster than 60 miles per hour. A standard would be drive at a reasonable rate. So rules are objective, clear, knowable beforehand. Standards are often determined in court. Another standard would be whether there's a preponderance of evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt. That is not a rule, but it is a standard. In the case of AI legislation, a rule could be that a person needs to test their model, or an AI developer needs to test their model for hazardous capabilities if the model is trained using greater than 10 to the 26 flop and cost over $100 million to train. An example of a standard in AI development is that AI developers need to exercise reasonable care, which we'll discuss what reasonable care is a bit more later in this presentation. The law has some specificity and is adaptable, which are other desirable properties. Its specificity helps reduce the risk of misinterpretation, whereas vague dictates given to an AI, such as respect humanity, doesn't necessarily help them and can be more easily misinterpreted. The law is much more specific and is generally easier to interpret to a trained reader. The law is also adaptable, and its adaptability is useful because this reduces the risk of gaming. So generally, there's a risk that AIs may find holes in systems, but the law does a collection of rules, for instance, could be like the tax code, which has a lot of rules. But if you add in standards such as, well, behave reasonably, then this can robustify collections of rules. So basically, the law can be adapted and patched, and standards can do a lot to patching that. I'll also mention that, just as an aside, in the future, AIs could help make the law more robust, more comprehensive, more specific, and help adapt it more quickly. Just as text editors, for instance, helped let laws get more complicated and comprehensive and specific, document lengths became much larger with the emergence of text editors and Microsoft Word. AIs could also possibly help make laws better. There's a cynical interpretation, I should say, which is that actually people are deliberately making laws more complex so as to justify their profession. But I'll pass that point by. The law is still silent, though, in some cases. It is not necessarily perfect, and we may need to look beyond just the law if we're looking for ethical behavior from AI systems, because it is silent, and sometimes laws are actually immoral. So let's speak about silent law. The law is not a complete guide to behavior, but rather more a set of constraints. It does not cover many important areas of our lives. For instance, the law does not determine what to do in many situations. The head of the Federal Reserve may set the interest rate, but what they choose is not legally determined. So the law puts some constraints, but inside of that, various policies are made, which are not necessarily a matter of law. The law does not require that people do good things when possible, like helping strangers in need in the United States. The law in the United States does not require a person to be a good person. It requires them not to do various types of harms to others, among other things, but it doesn't require that people be good people. It doesn't require that people tell the truth in most contexts. So the law isn't necessarily constraining enough to constrain AIs to behave in a beneficial way. So if we constrain AIs only with laws rather than guiding it with ethics, we risk them acting in undesirable ways. Let's take the example of chatbots. There are things that are illegal for chatbots to output, even though by default, one can roughly think about chatbots as having First Amendment protections. If they output copyrighted information, this can be illegal, and their developer could face penalties for this. Likewise, if AIs make libelous or defamatory claims, this could be illegal. Meanwhile, various other outputs are potentially legal, such as doxing and leaking personally identifiable information. Providing dual-use information that could be used for weaponization can be legal. Some of the existing laws are designed for humans and specifically describe intent states, or whether a person knowingly did something, which is much harder to establish or conceptualize when talking about AI systems. Likewise, generating unethical erotic literature about children could potentially be legal, by default is. Bomb instructions are also legal. Disseminating these is not necessarily that beneficial, but it is nonetheless legal. The Anarchist's Cookbook is protected by the First Amendment, and if an AI is sharing similar information, that can be protected by the First Amendment. So relying just on the law is not necessarily going to get you beneficial AI. That said, the law maybe could be strengthened to cover many of these cases. So although right now laws are very minimal for AIs and AI agents, potentially in the future it could be strengthened. One possible way to do this would be to require that AIs exercise reasonable care. So reasonable care is the level of caution and concern that an ordinary prudent person would use to avoid foreseeable harm to others. So right now, a lot of chatbots refuse to output information if it might offend someone. Instead, this would be saying that if the output would foreseeably harm someone, then don't output it. That is more restrictive than what is illegal, but not as restrictive as if it may potentially offend someone. So if AIs are required to exercise reasonable care, they would have more constraints than the current set of legal constraints. For instance, they should not be giving suicide instructions to users who seem extremely depressed and who have been contemplating suicide. Although it is legal for these AI systems to describe the most painless, most efficient, lowest backfiring risk ways of committing suicide, that information may be protected by the First Amendment to disseminate. If AIs are required to exercise reasonable care, since that would foreseeably cause harm, given that the user is depressed or highly depressed, then that would be restricted. Likewise, if a person is talking about blowing up a school and they've seemed to demonstrate quite an interest in this sort of thing, and they're asking for specific instructions for how to bomb the school and how to get away with it, although bomb instruction information is protected by the First Amendment, in this context, this could be violating a duty of reasonable care. So the law does have some notions that could help guide machine ethics, but they're currently not legally required of AIs. They are legally required of humans. So the people running AI companies have to exercise reasonable care to their customers, to their employees, but the AIs themselves do not have to. But potentially in the future, you could pass a law that would make them probably be more beneficial. Likewise, another point against the law is that sometimes it is immoral, or sometimes it is just really out of date. So obviously, slavery used to be legal. Various forms of discrimination used to be legal. There can be significant delays between when our norms evolve and whether they show up in the law. It's worth noting that AI legislation can take months to years. So if the approach is to have the law determine what AIs do and only the law, then that may lag behind what would be beneficial. Given that Congress has difficulty passing many things related to technology, maybe should not expect legislation to guide machine ethics in a way that keeps up with the rapidly moving developments. Likewise, in addition, court decisions can take years. So the law, although good and time-tested, is a bit slow because our institutions may be updated too slowly in many contexts. So we may need to look beyond the law. But overall, the law is comprehensive, but it's not comprehensive enough to ensure that the actions of an AI system are safe and beneficial. AI should follow the law as a baseline. This should set some basic constraints, but there should be other demands put on it if we're wanting beneficial behavior. Relying solely on the law would leave many gaps that AIs could exploit or make ethical errors within the law. So let's try and look at some notions beyond the law. And one such notion is fairness. Maybe in addition to making the AIs law-abiding, maybe we should make them fair. So let's speak about fairness and bias, because there's been much discussion about this even before chatbots and large language models. There are various biases that people have, such as xenophobia, and there are historical biases, such as slavery, which has had some lingering effects, and so on. And these can affect the observations that AIs train on. And these can also, in some ways, affect the algorithms that they use as well. And these biases can be propagated into these AI systems, which can end up affecting the real world. And so these biases may be perpetuated, and that can cause real-world harms. By default, if they're trained in naive ways, they could perpetuate various biases and make unfair decisions. Let's zoom into a classic example of a debate about fairness. So the Compass software used in the US justice system is a high-profile case of algorithmic decision-making by AIs alleged to be unfair. So as we can see at the right, there is a different risk score distribution for white and black defendants. And so it was argued that it disproportionately labeled African Americans at higher risk, and that is unfair. The counterclaim was that actually the AI system was calibrated, which means it was fair. This suggests that different people have different notions of fairness, and the result was a partially successful lawsuit. So let's talk about some of the notions of fairness often invoked in conversation. So there's the notion of individual fairness, which is about treating similar individuals similarly. Group fairness, groups with protected status characteristics such as race, gender, sexual orientation, those groups should receive similar outcomes to the majority. That's the notion of group fairness. Another notion is just procedural fairness, which is that there should be a transparent and consistent decision-making process that gives rise to the verdict. Distributive justice is a much stronger notion of fairness, which is that there should be equal distributions of resources. And another notion is counterfactual fairness, which would be that predictions are the same even if a protected status characteristic, such as race, were different, all else being equal. So if we try and concretize these notions, then we get three different statistical interpretations of fairness. So one is statistical parity. The algorithm is fair if it makes positive decisions at an equal rate for different groups. So positive decisions could be, for instance, labeling a person as high risk. The claim for statistical parity would be that for white and black and Asian, etc., all those groups should have the same proportion of people being labeled high risk. Another notion is equalized odds. The algorithm is fair if the false positive rate and the false negative rates are equal across groups. Another notion is that the algorithm is fair if the population long-run frequency of positives matches the predicted probabilities from the model. That would mean that if for a group, the AI is saying that 7% of them are high risk, and it is determined later on in the future that indeed it was actually around 7% were high risk, then it was fair, even if there were differences in groups. These are some different notions of fairness when tries to write them or describe them more formally through statistics. And unfortunately, though, there's an impossibility result. Namely that the three classic definitions of fairness are usually logically contradictory. There is no fair predictor in all senses. That is to say that even if you have a super intelligent AI system, it will not be able to satisfy all of these different notions of fairness across various inputs. Even, say, God couldn't do that because it is logically impossible. It is a logical impossibility to have all of these conditions satisfied at once. So due to the mutual incompatibility of broad notions of fairness, people then have shifted the discussion to fairness is much more context specific. But this has led there to be less to discuss. It's much harder to make a lot of academic progress when talking about a lot of specific cases without more generalizable insights or general principles. So to improve fairness, one could pick a notion of fairness, a statistical notion of fairness, and implement that, and that could be very systematic and transparent and intellectually defensible. But there may be various notions of fairness that are not being satisfied, and there can be other problems too. It may not address the problem holistically enough. So in addition to making it satisfy a statistical notion of fairness, there could be other sorts of approaches which improve fairness, such as participatory design, where in designing an AI system, stakeholders who will be impacted by these systems are brought along in the design process and give feedback, so that the technology is not imposed on them as much and many of their wants and desires are reflected in the system and systematic errors are caught earlier. Participatory design is a potential way to improve fairness. This is focused on reducing bad outcomes, not only just bad decisions, but some weaknesses are that there's more subjectivity, it's much more expensive, it's much more laborious. But overall, if one's trying to improve fairness, there are both technical and social approaches for doing so. Algorithmic fairness is a type of fairness most relevant to AI systems. The technical definitions of fairness are useful tools that can help flag problems, but the technical definitions are logically contradictory, so you have to pick. You can't pick them all. And there are approaches outside of just technical approaches for improving fairness, such as participatory design. All right, so we've spoken about the law and fairness. Let's speak about the default force governing AI development currently. And let's think about whether that is good or bad, or how good we should expect that to be, or under what conditions we should expect it to be good. So let's talk about the economic engine. The idea here is, why not just let the economy decide what AI will be like? Instead of having things mandated by law and the government, we can just let a consumer democracy decide, is the idea. And this is very common, this idea. In fact, some people would say that whatever is most economically efficient is what would be best. This approximates the views of the effective accelerationists, where they claim that one should stop fighting the thermodynamic will of the universe because the economy is aligned with the thermodynamic will of the universe. You cannot stop it and you should not stop it, so you may as well embrace it. This is probably, among the people who take AI very seriously, one of the most intellectually, or I should say socially, influential groups in the Bay Area, which is where most advanced AI is being built. So AIs are being developed by businesses. Their development is therefore closely tied to the businesses as economic goals, which may be, in the case of startups, revenue maximization, or in the case of later companies, profit maximization, which is their fiduciary duty. How will economic forces shape the development and behavior of AI? So I should note that in the previous two sections, I was speaking about AIs individually, that given an AI, what goal should it have? Should it be given constraints such as to follow the law? And what should we expect if that be the case? Should we require that the AIs be fair? This is talking about AI development generally a level above that. We're talking about AI development more broadly and its societal impacts, and less specifically the goals of individual AI systems. So AIs are designed to fill various economic niches, but they are not necessarily told, go out there and fill an economic niche. So we're not talking necessarily about explicit instructions given to AI systems, but instead how they are designed in the first place, the premise of these systems. So we're speaking a level of abstraction above what we were in the previous sections. Let's talk about why it may make sense to let the economy influence AI development and the design of AIs. There's some good arguments for why. One is that economic growth results in an increase in the production of goods and services. This growth has led to various Pareto improvements. Name your metric, say literacy, say access to food, whatever you want. Many of those metrics keep increasing as there is more economic growth, and they compound over time. So a variety of value systems are being satisfied through economic growth. An additional argument is the welfare theorem, or more specifically, the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, which is that when individuals pursue their self-interest within a market, they unintentionally actually contribute to societal welfare or economic value. We may wind up with Pareto efficient allocations, and there are some issues with that notion, but I'll not get into it in this lecture. So living standards improve. So there's some formal reasons to actually expect that people pursuing their self-interest and just letting a consumer democracy decide can actually result in good outcomes, and there's some math behind it. However, for this to hold, you need a variety of conditions. You need an open market. You need no seller big enough to raise prices alone. There's no producer privately holding a pivotal technology. There's no buyer big enough to lower prices. Everyone has perfect information. There are no externalities in consumption. The state enforces property and contract laws. So if you have those conditions all hold, then there is some strong alignment between individuals pursuing their self-interest and societal welfare as measured through economic social surplus. We'll talk about how some of these conditions may fail, or how they may not hold, and how this can end up undermining the economy's ability to secure good outcomes for all of us. So the main way in which this happens is market failures. So we saw there was a condition, everyone has perfect information. But sometimes there are substantial information asymmetries, where one party exploits knowledge that the other party doesn't have. An example would be predatory lending. But in the case of AI, you could think about AI systems that are very good at manipulating individuals, and individuals may not know they're being manipulated. Additionally, AI development is also extremely fast moving, and so a lot of information may not propagate quickly enough, and this can lead to much less efficient self-organization in the economy. For instance, many people are unaware of what's likely to happen in AI next year. Many people's predictions are quite a bit off. Many people were unaware of NVIDIA's potential prospects until fairly recently, whereas other people who are following AI development much more closely, I think, could have reliably seen that NVIDIA was a very good investment back in 2020 after GPT-3. Another potential market failure is that of a monopoly. So a monopoly is a firm with enough influence to impact the market price. A monopoly is a single leading organization. You could also have oligopolies, and these can lead to higher prices and worse quality for all consumers. Could easily imagine AI companies becoming monopolies. There's substantial barriers to entry. One has to buy a substantial number of GPUs to have a very competitive AI company at the frontier. The number of GPUs that one must buy is increasing exponentially each year. So one should expect that market to consolidate more and many competitors to keep dropping out. And if those AI companies become more and more powerful, they could entrench themselves. They could engage in regulatory capture. They could also engage in academic capture of getting academics dependent on them for access to their AI models. This is another path to a market failure and why one shouldn't necessarily expect the economic engine left to its own devices or the free market left to its own devices to necessarily secure the most beneficial outcomes for humanity. And when monopolies arise, antitrust concerns can become substantial enough so as to lead to companies to being broken up. A third market failure are externalities, which is another condition that was assumed away in the fundamental theorem of welfare economics. So for the economic engine to work well for all of us, we need to control externalities. There's environmental damage from AI. The AIs require increasingly more power. Soon they'll be requiring the power of Seattle to train. And there's also privacy violations. There's also risks imposed on society when they're more potentially catastrophic. These externalities could be internalized, though, through litigation and liability. So if an AI causes harm and AI developers could potentially be found liable, this would cause them to proceed more carefully and take AI safety more seriously. However, if they can just capture the economic benefits and don't have to pay for any of the damage caused, then this can lead to a substantial moral hazard and lead to more and more externalities. There are other ways externalities could be reduced. Privacy violations could be mitigated through more defined property rights. And if there's some activities that produce externalities that we don't want to happen as much, there could be taxation. So one could imagine taxation reducing the amount of environmental damage. So another concern with the economic engine is inequality. Economic resources, such as income and wealth, are unevenly distributed. Some may view this as an inevitable fact of nearly all social structures or all social arrangements. There still is a steepness parameter, though, which can change in societies. So inequality has increased, although some inequality may be inevitable or nearly inevitable. There still is possible for there to be differences in the steepness in inequality. Why care about inequality? Well, it's highly correlated with things like aggression and social tension and political instability. So there are many reasons to try and reduce it. It seems to harm overall collective functioning. It's very plausible that inequality would increase with AIs. The capital owners, the people who own lots of GPUs, enough GPUs at scale to get economies of scale, can capture economic value and have AIs automate work. Meanwhile, typical workers who don't have highly efficient supercomputers cannot sell their labor because they've been automated away and they have no bargaining power anymore in society, or their main source of bargaining power, namely their labor, goes away. So one could possibly expect a rich get richer, poor get poorer type of effect due to automation if there are no interventions. So this is one reason to not be completely satisfied with the claim that we should just let the economy decide what should happen with AI. There are other critiques, which is that even if you fix market failures and economic social surplus increases and GDP increases and wealth is maximized, this is not necessarily social value. So one notion we've been looking at in this is one of the early figures is GDP. GDP is not necessarily societal well-being. Many socially valuable tasks like parenting are not captured. Even the value of Google searches is not captured in GDP. So the economic engine, which helps increase GDP, isn't necessarily tethered to social value or fails to capture many parts of social value. And in the future with automation, it could end up tracking less and less it may become a poor proxy with automation. Separate point is that the first fundamental welfare theorem of economics is not necessarily talking about actual well-being or welfare. It's actually talking about societal welfare measured in money and wealth. It's not talking about social connections. It's not directly talking about health or jobs or sense of purpose and so on. And happiness depends on more than just wealth. It depends on those various other things. Additionally, increases in GDP and wealth do not necessarily make people happier. This is the Easterlin paradox. So at the right is a figure from NORC at the University of Chicago, and they've been collecting happiness statistics for the past few decades. And as we can see, there is not a substantial difference across time in people's happiness. During this time period, I believe real GDP has gone up 4x. We have not seen happiness have a similar exponentially increasing trend. The downward or the decrease in happiness recently was due to COVID. That actually had a real impact on it. But a lot of the economic developments in the past decades have not had substantial impacts on well-being or happiness in the United States. There are alternative measures of well-being, economic measures of well-being, such as the Human Developmental Index, which includes things like education level. And there are other notions like gross national happiness. In conclusion, AI development currently prioritizes economic motivations. There are very few regulations and is very little legislation about AI. So it is largely the economy deciding what AI will be like. AIs may increase efficiency and economic growth, but this may also cause inequality and various market failures. And so we shouldn't necessarily expect that to have AIs be highly beneficial and increase social welfare as a consequence. Indeed, even if these market failures were fixed, these economic notions of welfare still may come apart from other sources of well-being. And so having just the economy guide AI development is likely insufficient for creating beneficial AI, but there will still likely be many benefits from AI as incentivized by the economy. So we spoke about social welfare and well-being and how wealth is not necessarily well-being. So let's zoom into this notion of well-being, and then we'll break it down and talk about three different interpretations of well-being. First, how well-being is defined is debatable. However, it's commonly considered to be an intrinsic good. Well-being generally refers to how well a person's life is going for them. So there are three common accounts of well-being. There's well-being as pleasure or happiness. There's well-being as a set of quote-unquote objective goods. And third, there is well-being as desire or preference satisfaction. The first notion of well-being is that well-being is pleasure. The balance of pleasure or happiness over pain or suffering is what constitutes well-being, and this is also called hedonism. So this is one theory of well-being. While we all may have different preferences and desires, pleasure does seem to be universally valued. There are a few people who would claim that it has no value or that it is not an intrinsic good. The hedonist will claim that, in fact, it is the only thing that matters in itself, and everything else is just instrumental for achieving pleasure. However, some would say that actually pleasure is not the only thing that matters. Other things matter, like having knowledge. So this other view is that more than pleasure matters. You don't just want pleasure. You want other sorts of things. You want to engage in rational activity. You want to develop your abilities. You want to pursue projects. You want to have children. You want to gain knowledge. You want to have awareness of true beauty. You want to have moral goodness, etc. And so this is objective goods, that there's a sort of a set of goods, and people should have all of those goods increase in number or be beyond some threshold in their life for their life to have gone well, for them to have had well-being. A challenge with this view is that what are those goods? And that tends to be a bit more arbitrary. People propose many different lists. But this is a multi-objective notion of well-being. And then finally, there's another notion of well-being, which is that well-being is preference or desire satisfaction. The claim is that what really matters for well-being is that our desires or preferences are satisfied. There are different types of preferences. There are stated preferences. For example, a person may say that their preference was satisfied, or imagine AI is trying to satisfy a person's preferences. There are different ways of interpreting a person's preference. A person may say, I prefer an AI's output, X, or there could be their revealed preference of what they actually choose. And then there's their idealized preference, which is that what they would have chosen if they had more information or more contemplation time. An example of a stated preference, somebody could say, my favorite song is X. Meanwhile, their revealed preference may actually be different. They may actually listen to a different song more than their favorite song. And so their revealed preference would suggest that actually a different song is their favorite song than the one that they stated. And their idealized preference could be totally different. It could be a song that they had never heard of, but if they had heard it, then it would have been their favorite song. So we'll discuss preferences in more detail later. Well-being is important to understand for other reasons when talking about AI and ethics. One is that it's important to understand how AIs may end up influencing human well-being. For instance, an AI chatbot could influence human well-being substantially. If they aim to maximize revealed preferences, they may addict us, and that could leave us very unhappy, even though we are highly engaged. If they aim to maximize pleasure, they could give us a lot of amusing but shallow content, like TikTok content. If they aim to maximize objective goods, they may push us to pursue self-development goals that we do not wish for ourselves. Another topic in AI and ethics is AI well-being, which is relevant when or if AIs become conscious. So if AIs become conscious, then we need to think about different notions of well-being. If we observe conscious, coherently acting AIs, then they could have well-being according to a preference view of well-being. If they're acting completely randomly, it's harder to claim. And if AIs can do things like reason and gain knowledge and develop their abilities and have social relations with other AIs and humans, then they could count and be thought morally valuable and have well-being according to an objective goods view of well-being. A stronger condition for pleasure would be that they would need to have valence consciousness or sentience. And if they had valence consciousness, that is consciousness that has a good or bad gloss to it, or positive or negative gloss to it, then one could think that that has some relation with pleasure, and then they would be morally valuable. So some forms of well-being may be easier to emerge than others. If they become conscious and are coherently acting, then they may start to matter morally under a preference view of well-being, for instance. Let's zoom into the preference view of well-being in a bit more detail and talk about how it relates to AI. This proposal is, why not just have AI satisfy people's preferences? If we do that, then won't AI be beneficial for humanity? To think about preference satisfaction, we need to speak about preferences in a bit more detail. A preference is a tendency to favor one thing over another, and a preference always involves a comparison between two or more alternatives. And as we mentioned, there are three types of preferences: revealed, stated, and idealized. Let's speak about revealed preferences. These are preferences of what people actually choose. The idea is that let people decide what they like and what is good for them. We're not listening to what they said they liked, but we're looking at what they actually ended up liking or choosing. Recommender systems rely very heavily on revealed preferences. They look at what people click on, what people engage with, what people spend more time looking at. And with these revealed preferences, they can recommend content that satisfies more revealed preferences. There are some drawbacks. For instance, misinformation can be highly engaging, and there can be manipulation. So one could further satisfy revealed preferences by exploiting biases in people. And an additional way in which revealed preferences may be satisfied more is by exploiting weakness of will, by giving people content that they can't resist, but is not necessarily good for their functioning. As a consequence, recommender systems pursue revealed preferences or help increase the satisfaction of revealed preferences, but this is not necessarily something that makes people better off, according to other notions of well-being. Then there's the notion of stated preferences. Maybe instead of having AIs satisfy revealed preferences as recommender systems do, maybe we should just ask people what their preferences are and have AIs pursue that. This solves some of the issues with revealed preferences because people may be able to articulate why their behavior differs from their desires. For instance, someone may smoke, but they may not prefer to smoke. And AIs may be exploiting weakness of will. But if they pursued what they stated that they would want, then perhaps AIs wouldn't exploit some addiction. So revealed preferences are accounted for in recommender systems. Chatbots currently are partly driven by stated preferences. So in reinforcement learning from human feedback and direct preference optimization and supervised fine-tuning of chatbots, humans provide direct feedback to AIs by ranking outputs. So direct preference optimization learns based on stated human preferences. A person says, I prefer this output to that output. You may have seen on ChatGPT's interface that you can sometimes put a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and this can give the AI a stated preference. Meanwhile, a revealed preference may be something like how long do they spend on the website? There's some complications with stated preferences, though. The outcome of some preferences may not necessarily be known. Should the preferences of dead people matter? There are issues that people may have preferences about other people's preferences, and this could lead to double counting. Some people may have harmful preferences. Should these be satisfied? Some people are unsure about many of their preferences. Some people's preferences change quite a bit over time. Some people's preferences may be highly uninformed and may actually be harmful for them. And so this gives rise to a different notion of preferences, which would be idealized preferences. This is about what a fully informed person would do. In theory, idealized preferences avoid misinformation, weakness of will, manipulation, or false beliefs. However, we don't know how to idealize preferences in practice, so this is a nice idea in theory. There was the preference account, and we raised various issues with revealed and stated preferences. So there's this notion of idealized preferences, but idealized preferences are difficult to talk about concretely in practice. Some other reasons would be that people's idealized preferences still may be malicious. A person, even with fuller information, still may have malicious preferences. And people may also just disagree with their idealized preferences. They may view this as a form of paternalism. One way in which preferences could be more idealized is possibly with a quote-unquote AI ideal advisor, which gives ideal advice to people to help them make better decisions. It's often difficult for people to consider and weigh all available information, and AIs could do a lot of that cognitive labor for them when they are more uncertain. So AI ideal advisors are a potential path for helping people come up with more idealized preferences and state them or recognize them. And this could make alignment with preferences more likely to lead to beneficial outcomes. Preferences seem to be important to well-being. One of the three main accounts of well-being are preferences. Revealed preferences assume that people's actions demonstrate what they want. Stated preferences assume that people can articulate what they want. Idealized preferences are what a fully informed person would choose with a lot of contemplation time and awareness. Each form of preferences has limitations in the context of AIs. Another account of well-being was happiness. Why not just tell the AIs to make people happy? What are some pros and cons of having AIs pursue this notion of well-being? We know that people can make decisions that hurt their own happiness. They may engage in self-destructive behaviors. They may engage in short-term gratification and hedonistic activity and not recognize various prudential reasons for acting. Happiness is not always in a person's control either. The environment matters, and AIs could help increase human happiness by understanding what factors influence it and what can be done to increase it. So AIs do have some sense of well-being and happiness. If you give it various different scenarios, they can distinguish between cases that are more likely to cause a lot of suffering versus a lot of happiness. And AIs that have an understanding of happiness can also cause less harm. So AIs can have their decision-making augmented with general purpose sort of happiness function. Here on this slide, we're calling it a utility function, so as to avoid outcomes that would result in significantly reduced well-being. So if an agent is given a context, C sub t, and it has a variety of actions, A sub 1 through A sub n, a happiness model or a utility model could process the context and proposed actions, and some of those actions may be harmful. It may predict that it will result in negative well-being, and we could use this understanding of whether it is likely to cause harm and suffering to people to filter out those sorts of actions. So you may remember from the reinforcement learning slide, a higher Q value means more choice worthiness. It is more likely to be chosen by the AI. And if the utility or happiness of a particular action in a context is beneath a threshold tau, so say that tau is negative 10, if the expected happiness of a certain action is less than negative 10, then the Q value decreases by gamma. And you could assume gamma is something like 100. This would then decrease the overall Q value associated with that action, the scrupulous Q value associated with that action, and make the AI substantially less likely to choose that action. Fortunately, AI's understandings of what people like or what makes them happy and what makes them suffer can be used to guide AI's actions so that they behave more beneficially and less harmfully to people. This is an explicit way of approaching machine ethics, which is guiding AIs with happiness estimation functions. They're not directly optimizing happiness, but you can at least use these happiness functions to filter out particularly harmful actions and promote potentially highly beneficial actions. There are some contemplations with happiness, though. People can be happy without achieving anything, and people who subscribe to an objective goods view of well-being would take issue with people who are just happy but have not pursued projects or have not achieved anything. And people can also achieve a lot, though, without being happy. Should we encourage either of these approaches? An additional challenge with happiness is that an AI tasked with increasing human happiness might wirehead us or give us things that make us happy, but ultimately are not good for our well-being. So imagine it's a post-automation economy. It could give us a lot of junk food. It could give us a lot of entertaining content and may give us drugs to bliss us out and stimulate our pleasure centers. This is not necessarily a good outcome according to people who have an objective goods view of well-being. So the objective goods view includes more than just pleasure, as mentioned before. But as mentioned before, it has criticisms of being more paternalistic or elitist. So in talking about happiness, AIs can be applied to improve human happiness. They can have their actions screened, actions that cause a lot of harm to people be filtered out. That is already a possibility. So we can start to approach machine ethics more explicitly with happiness functions or general purpose welfare functions. However, happiness in theory has some sort of wireheading problem, the problem of people just being blissed out, having what some would say are more meaningless existences. I'm going to skip social welfare functions in the interest of time. That section is largely about maximizing the sum total of well-being and trading off well-being with equity. So how can we trade off a total well-being and efficiency with equity? That's what the social welfare functions section is about. I'll now just jump to moral uncertainty, which is how can we more broadly accommodate a broader helping of values, not just well-being and equity? How can we accommodate even more values? And so this is the challenge of moral uncertainty. How can we act morally when we are unsure about which moral view is correct? I've raised a lot of considerations for and against various structures that promote various different values, such as the economic engine, such as law, such as happiness, such as stated preference satisfaction. Well, a background concept in thinking about moral uncertainty is credence. Credence is the probability assigned by an individual of the chance that a theory is true. So a person may say that the best course is to let the economic engine decide what will be like, and they may assign that a credence of 60%. And maybe they'll assign that the law could actually give the most beneficial AI systems. They may give that a credence of 30%, and so on. So in high stakes moral decisions, such as healthcare, or in designing what advanced AI systems should be like, we will face moral uncertainty, and we need to accommodate this uncertainty somehow. The default approach that people do is they have their favorite theory. They only support the theory in which they have the highest credence. They look at the list from earlier and say, I think that the objective goods account of well-being is the most compelling, and therefore AIs ought to optimize a set of objective goods, and they shouldn't have any other objectives. That should be their only objective. That is a my favorite theory way of approaching moral uncertainty. You give 100% of the weight of the thing that you believe in most and 0 weight to everything else. A different approach is to give a weighted average. So if an action is considered, you could consider how useful it is on an objective goods account of well-being, whether this is in keeping with the law, whether this increases pleasure, and so on. And the choice-worthiness of an action will then be determined by the value assigned by all these different moral systems, weighted by their credence. So that's a complicated structure. I won't speak much more about that. Instead, I'll speak about a moral parliament, which is that treat the decision of what an AI should do as a negotiation in a parliament, considering multiple moral views and find a mutually acceptable solution. AIs could represent moral perspectives and undergo democratic processes. They could discuss with representatives of other value systems, they could negotiate, and they could ultimately vote. So, for example, let's say that there is a representative, an AI that represents economic interests. Let's say that there is an AI that represents a group of people's preferences. And let's say we have some AI that really doesn't want anything legally gray going on. Then they could negotiate with each other about what an AI should do next in real time. I have in this figure an example of a virtue ethicist AI, utilitarian AI, and a deontologist AI. But you could imagine many different AIs arguing for different value systems and negotiating with each other. And then after they negotiate, they ultimately vote. Their voting power may be in proportion to one's credence of different value systems. So in a local transportation matter, there could be an AI representing each of the residents, each of the corporations, each of the environmental groups, et cetera, and they could all discuss very quickly in a matter of a few seconds, and then the AI could make its decision after simulating that negotiation process. This is a bit difficult to do now because the AIs are a bit slower, but as they get faster, one could very rapidly simulate one of these negotiation processes, and this could be used in cases where there are a lot of values in conflict. This is basically what we do in society when a lot of different values conflict. We have them negotiate in a parliament and then vote. So the idea is to do this at a smaller scale for individual AI decisions that are more morally ambiguous or where there are more clashes between different value systems. This is a potential approach to moral uncertainty and the fact that we don't necessarily have just one value system that we would endorse 100% completely. Moral parliament allows one to represent a diverse set of views and scalably represent new moral views by just adding new parliamentary members. The process is very transparent. One can keep track of which perspectives were listened to and how much weight they were given. And it can encourage compromise and negotiation. It can also help one overlook important moral views and not implicitly assign their values to zero. And it allows human values to change over time by changing the representatives in such a system. So I think that the moral parliament approach is a fairly promising way of incorporating many of the values and systems that we described earlier in this lecture. I would encourage checking out the social welfare functions section in the book, since there is a good discussion and the trade-off between efficiency and equity and how to, in a principled way, trade off between the two. But overall, hopefully this presentation gave an appreciation of many of the philosophical complexities with the law, with just trusting the economy to do the right thing, and with the complexities associated with well-being and how there are many different accounts of well-being, such as preferences, and even when looking at preferences, there are many different types of preferences. This was largely an attempt of giving a bird's eye view of many of the different value systems and their strengths and weaknesses. Thank you, and this concludes the lecture.